In a world where power and secrets collide, one man's rise to the top would change the course of an entire nation. But behind the iron-fisted leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré lies a scandal so deep, it threatens to unravel everything he built. Stick around, because what you're about to discover will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, hypocrisy, and the price of a nation's soul. Burkina Faso, a land of dry savannas and rich cultural history, had long stood as a quiet witness to the struggles of West Africa. Yet, in 2022, its history would take a dramatic turn, one that would reverberate through the region for years to come. It was in this moment of crisis and uncertainty that Ibrahim Traoré, a young and charismatic military officer, rose from the shadows to seize control of the country's future. Burkina Faso had been suffering under the leadership of Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba, whose inability to suppress the growing insurgencies from radical Islamic groups had left the nation on the brink of collapse. The army's morale was at an all-time low, and the civilian population, worn thin from years of conflict, began to lose hope. But the winds of change were stirring, and they found their voice in the form of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. In September 2022, Traoré led a successful coup that ousted Damiba, citing the former leader's failure to protect the country as his main justification. The young officer's image was that of a hero, brave, decisive, and determined to restore order. He presented himself as the savior of Burkina Faso, promising a new dawn for the people. His speeches echoed through the streets of Ouagadougou, the capital, with fervent calls for national unity, security, and the restoration of pride. But beneath the facade of a determined military leader lay a more complex figure, one whose actions, both in public and in private, were far from as clear-cut as they seemed. In the months that followed the coup, Traoré's government took bold steps, aligning itself with Russia, severing ties with France, the former colonial power, and consolidating its grip over the country's institutions. One of his first and most controversial moves was the implementation of sweeping reforms to the country's marriage laws. On the surface, this seemed to be a measure to protect the traditional family structure and promote the values of religion and custom. The new law explicitly criminalized homosexuality, marking it as a punishable offense. In a country where traditional values were already deeply ingrained, this act resonated with many as a defense of cultural integrity. Law, hailed by many as a victory for conservative forces, was just the beginning of a much larger shift. Traoré's power, at least on the surface, seemed unshakable. He had the backing of the military, the political system was falling into place, and the people seemed to be rallying behind his vision of a strong, sovereign Burkina Faso. But even as the nation turned to him as its new guiding force, there were whispers in the shadows, rumors of secret meetings, of hidden truths that could destroy everything. As Traoré's popularity surged, so did the tension within his own ranks. Could the man who had positioned himself as a protector of traditional values really hide the truth of his own personal life? The law he had enacted may have been his greatest public victory, but in private, it would soon prove to be his greatest personal challenge. As the world watched Ibrahim Traoré rise to power, they saw a leader who promised change, justice, and a return to the country's values. But behind closed doors, one of his most controversial decisions was about to spark a national crisis. The law he passed, meant to protect tradition, would soon reveal the deepest of secrets, secrets that would shake the very foundation of his reign. The announcement came swiftly, a decree that would forever change the social landscape of Burkina Faso. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, now firmly in control of the government, was ready to make his mark on history. His military government, operating under the banner of national security and tradition, had drafted a new law that would redefine marriage in the country. The law, introduced in early 2023, was bold and unyielding. It would recognize only marriages that adhered strictly to religious and cultural customs, and in doing so, it would outlaw same-sex relationships. The law was passed with overwhelming support from both the military and a significant portion of the civilian population. Its passage was seen as a triumph for the conservative values that Traoré had so strongly championed in his speeches. For too long, Burkina Faso has been subject to foreign pressures, foreign values, Traoré declared in his televised address to the nation, his voice steady and full of conviction. We will no longer be dictated to by outside forces. This is our country, and we will preserve the sanctity of our culture and traditions. His words were met with cheers from those in the audience, and many throughout the nation hailed the law as a victory, a return to what they believed was the true spirit of Burkina Faso. The law itself was clear. Any acts of homosexuality would be considered criminal, punishable by law. Public displays of same-sex affection were now forbidden, and those who broke the law could face severe penalties. While the law garnered praise from many, others were troubled by its implications. Human rights organizations and LGBTQ+ advocacy groups immediately condemned the law, calling it discriminatory and harmful. International powers, particularly from the West, were quick to express their outrage. The United States, the European Union, and various United Nations bodies issued statements decrying the move, with some even threatening to impose sanctions or withdraw aid from Burkina Faso. As the international community took a stand, inside the country, things were much more complicated. Traoré had presented the law as a step toward protecting the values of religion, family, and morality. He spoke about the growing influence of the West and the need for Burkina Faso to resist foreign interference in its way of life. But beneath this rhetoric, there were those who saw the law as a way to solidify his control over the country by aligning himself with conservative forces. But as the law was being enacted, something far more personal and dangerous was brewing beneath the surface. In the heart of the military leadership, whispers began to circulate. Some within Traoré's inner circle grew suspicious, uneasy with the absolute nature of his stance on morality and tradition. Rumors spread of a secret relationship, one that could tarnish the very public image that Traoré had so carefully crafted. Despite his public persona as a traditionalist, some believed that Ibrahim Traoré was hiding a secret, one that, if revealed, could destroy his entire regime. The speculation grew louder, and soon enough, a small but growing faction within the government began to investigate the possibility that the man who had created such a polarizing law was also secretly living a life that would make a mockery of everything he preached. But Traoré was not a fool. He knew that the stakes were high. His marriage law had secured his place as a protector of tradition in the eyes of the people, but it also placed him under an immense microscope. Any misstep, any slip of the mask, and his carefully constructed empire could crumble. The law was not just a political move, it was personal. It was a line in the sand. And as much as he wanted to believe in his own righteousness, a nagging doubt began to creep into his mind. As Burkina Faso's people debated the merits and dangers of the new law, the truth about Ibrahim Traoré's life was inching closer to the surface. The same man who had promised to protect the nation's values had a secret so dangerous that it could not remain hidden for much longer. The stage was set for a scandal of unprecedented proportions. The law had been passed, and Captain Ibrahim Traoré's power seemed unshakable. But behind the walls of his military regime, a secret was festering, one that could destroy everything he had worked for. As the whispers grew louder, the truth began to unravel, and what was once hidden in the shadows now threatened to come into the light. It began like any other military operation, strategic, calculated, and carefully hidden from the public eye. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who had ascended to power on a wave of promises and nationalist rhetoric, the stakes were high. His military coup, his political reforms, and his new law had all been steps towards solidifying his position. But with each passing day, the mask he had carefully crafted began to show cracks. The whispers started slowly, murmurs of a forbidden relationship, a relationship that, if revealed, could unravel the very foundation of his regime. It wasn't the first time such rumors had circulated in the halls of power, but this was different. The rumors weren't just idle chatter. They were the truth. The man at the heart of this scandal wasn't a mere political rival, nor a disgruntled ally seeking revenge. He was someone much closer, someone who had shared not only the burdens of military strategy with Traore, but also his most private moments. His lover, a high-ranking officer in the military, was someone trusted by the captain himself, someone who had played an integral role in his rise to power. At first, the affair had been well guarded, hidden in plain sight. Their meetings were brief but intense, held in the secluded parts of the military compound, far away from prying eyes. The captain, always in control in front of the public, was a different man when the two were alone. Behind closed doors, there was no facade, only the raw emotions that Traore had suppressed for years. Their relationship had been a quiet rebellion in itself. While Traore spoke of moral laws and conservative values to the people of Burkina Faso, he was secretly falling in love with someone who defied everything he publicly espoused. Their bond was undeniable, forged in the heat of power, shared ambitions, and the weight of secrets they carried together. But no secret, however well guarded, remains hidden forever. As time passed, the affair became harder to conceal. What had once been fleeting moments of passion behind closed doors began to leak into the public sphere. Small details, innocent at first, began to stand out. A passing glance, a brief moment of intimacy between the two officers, all of it was slowly catching the eye of those who had been carefully watching the rise of the young leader. The most dangerous part was not the affair itself. It was the growing realization that those closest to Traore were beginning to piece the truth together. His inner circle, loyal at first, started to doubt the man they had sworn to serve. Was he really the traditionalist he had claimed to be? Or was he merely using that image to further his own ambitions, all while secretly betraying the very principles he sought to protect? One afternoon, a seasoned military officer who had once been a trusted ally of Traore found himself alone in the captain's office. He had just finished a report and, as was his habit, stayed behind to go over some personal documents left on the desk. But it wasn't the documents that caught his attention. It was something far more dangerous. A photo, partially hidden in a drawer, fell out as he reached for a file. The picture was of Ibrahim Traoré and his lover, taken in a secluded corner of a military retreat months before, their arms wrapped around each other, a rare moment of vulnerability that had been captured on camera. The officer's heart raced. He knew what he had seen, and in that moment he realized the power of what this discovery could mean. The officer's first instinct was to disregard it. Perhaps it was nothing, perhaps it was a misunderstanding, but the seed of doubt had been planted. This was no ordinary photograph. It was evidence that, if revealed, would expose the captain for who he truly was. The officer debated the consequences of reporting this discovery. It would tear apart the very foundation of Traoré's rule. The captain had built his reputation on being a man of principle, of fighting for tradition. To expose him as a hypocrite would not only destroy his career, but would likely spark an uncontrollable backlash from the public. The scandal would be monumental, a political earthquake that could shake the entire country to its core. But the officer wasn't the only one who knew. Others within the military and political elite had also begun to catch wind of the affair. Some saw it as an opportunity to exploit Traoré's vulnerabilities for their own gain. Whispers of the relationship spread quickly, even reaching the ears of Traoré's political enemies who had been waiting for the right moment to strike. As the rumors intensified, the pressure on Traoré mounted. His military allies, once loyal and unquestioning, began to pull back. There was a growing unease in the air, a sense that the captain's grip on power was weakening. It wasn't just the law that was being scrutinized anymore. It was his very identity. The man who had so forcefully condemned homosexuality was now being forced to face the truth of his own desires. Behind closed doors, Traoré knew that the time for hiding was over. His secrets, once buried beneath layers of power and authority, were now dangerously close to being exposed. The affair that had once been a private rebellion had now become a political weapon. As the country waited for the next chapter in Traoré's leadership, it seemed inevitable. The truth was coming. And when it did, everything would change. The air in Burkina Faso had grown heavy with anticipation. What had once been a nation rallying behind Captain Ibrahim Traoré's leadership now simmered with tension. The bold new law that had criminalized same-sex relationships was still fresh in the public's mind. Yet an undercurrent of uncertainty flowed through the streets, hidden beneath the surface. While many celebrated Traoré's law as a victory for tradition, others began to question the very man who had passed it. In the high-security corridors of power, where decisions were made behind closed doors, a quiet revolt had begun. Some of the captain's most trusted allies, the men and women who had fought alongside him in the coup, had started to notice the cracks in his facade. There were subtle signs, fleeting moments, and then there was the photograph. The image that had been discovered by the seasoned military officer weeks earlier was now circulating among a small but growing group of people who knew the truth. At a clandestine meeting in the heart of Ouagadougou, several key members of Traoré's inner circle gathered in secret. They sat in a small, dimly lit room, the tension in the air palpable. Their faces were a mix of concern and disbelief. They had supported Traoré's rise to power, believing in his vision for a stronger, sovereign Burkina Faso. But now, they faced a moral dilemma, one that threatened to tear apart everything they had worked for. One of them, Colonel Jean-Baptiste, a loyal officer who had served under Traoré since the beginning, spoke first, his voice low and urgent. "We cannot pretend that this is nothing anymore. The photograph, it's proof. It's proof of the hypocrisy we've been turning a blind eye to all along." Another officer, Major Amadou, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "You're right, but what do we do now? Traoré has the support of the military. He's our leader. If we expose him now, the entire government falls apart." "Not necessarily," Jean-Baptiste replied, his eyes sharp. "The truth always has a way of coming out, and when it does, we can either control it or it controls us. It's only a matter of time before the public learns the truth. We can't keep hiding behind closed doors forever." The room fell silent as each person absorbed the gravity of the situation. For years, they had supported Traoré, believing him to be the savior of Burkina Faso. But now, the very man who had promised to uphold traditional values was the one who had secretly defied them. The laws he had imposed, the speeches he had delivered, the promises he had made, they were all based on a lie. It was not just the affair that had begun to shake their trust in him. It was the sheer audacity of his hypocrisy. Traoré had publicly condemned homosexuality, branding it a crime, while privately living a life that contradicted everything he claimed to stand for. His actions had exposed him as a man willing to manipulate the very ideals he pretended to uphold, all to protect his own political ambitions. The news of the photograph had already reached some of the highest offices in the country. Some within the political establishment had started to weigh their options, contemplating whether to use the scandal to bring down the military regime or, at the very least, challenge Traoré's power. The truth about his affair, about his secret life, was no longer something that could be ignored. It was becoming the most dangerous weapon in Burkina Faso's political battle. In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder. Journalists, both local and international, began to dig deeper, asking questions that Traoré could no longer ignore. Rumors spread about secret meetings, hidden messages, and quiet investigations into the military leader's personal life. The pressure on him intensified, and soon it became clear that no amount of denial could stop the truth from surfacing. Traoré was not blind to the growing storm. He could feel the tension shifting around him, the once loyal allies becoming increasingly distant, the international community circling in, waiting for him to stumble. For a man who had prided himself on his strength and decisiveness, this was a battle he had never anticipated, a battle not for the future of his country, but for his own survival. One evening, As the sun set over Ouagadougou, Traoré sat alone in his private office. His mind raced. He had always been a man who thrived under pressure, who made bold moves and took risks. But this was different. This was not a war on the battlefield. This was a war for his soul. The walls were closing in, and every decision he made now would determine whether he could continue to lead or whether his own secrets would be his undoing. As he sat in silence, the weight of his choices pressing down on him, Traoré's thoughts drifted back to the days before the coup, the promises he had made to the people, the vision of a free and independent Burkina Faso. He had sacrificed so much to get here, so much to be the man the people had believed in. But now the truth had caught up with him, and he had to make a choice. Could he live with the consequences of his own hypocrisy? Could he continue to lead a nation that was beginning to turn against him, or would he be forced to confront the truth in a way he never expected? In that moment, Ibrahim Traoré knew that the time for hiding was over. The truth was coming, and it would either destroy him or set him free. The pressure was mounting. As the whispers grew louder, so did the sense of inevitability. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who had so carefully crafted an image of moral authority, now found himself walking a fine line. The affair that had once been a secret whispered only in the dark corners of Burkina Faso's military and political elite was now on the cusp of becoming public knowledge. And when it did, everything would change. It wasn't just the photograph that had surfaced. Evidence, quietly collected by those with a vested interest in bringing Traoré down, was beginning to leak. A recording here, a message there, small pieces of a much larger puzzle, all pointing to the same shocking truth. The man who had publicly condemned homosexuality had been living a secret life that contradicted everything he stood for. The first real blow came on a quiet Wednesday evening. The journalist, a seasoned investigative reporter named Sophie Diallo, had been following the story from the beginning. Sophie had spent years unraveling corruption in Burkina Faso's government, and she had always known that Traoré's rise to power wasn't as clean as it appeared. She had received anonymous tips, seen the strange patterns in government communications, and heard rumors from those close to the captain. Sophie had managed to get her hands on a confidential military report detailing one of the captain's private meetings with his lover. The document, filled with encrypted messages and coded language, outlined the nature of their relationship and included a series of photographs, not unlike the one that had been discovered by Jean-Baptiste. The language in the report was damning, and Sophie knew she had to act quickly. This was the break she had been waiting for. She rushed to her editor, eager to break the news, but she knew that the timing had to be perfect. Exposing Traoré now would undoubtedly send shockwaves through the country, but Sophie also understood the danger of a premature leak. This was bigger than just a political scandal. It was a question of leadership, morality, and the future of Burkina Faso. The truth, when revealed, would reshape the nation in ways no one could predict. By the following morning, Sophie had written her story. It was bold, it was damning, and it was full of the kind of detail that would leave no room for doubt. The article, titled The Hidden Life of a Leader, Captain Traoré's Secret Affair, would run in the next edition of Le Faso, a national newspaper that had been known for its critical stance against the government. Sophie's editor, fully aware of the potential consequences, hesitated for a moment, but then gave the green light. The headline screamed of betrayal, of hypocrisy. The article detailed not only the affair, but also the implications it had for Traoré's public stance on homosexuality and traditional values. The images of Traoré and his lover, taken in secret moments of intimacy, were published alongside the article, leaving little room for doubt. The country was stunned. At first, there was silence. The city of Ouagadougou seemed to hold its breath, as though the streets themselves knew the magnitude of what had just been unleashed. Then, as people began to digest the news, the reactions flooded in. Some were shocked, some were outraged, and others felt betrayed by the man they had once admired as a hero. How could the captain, the leader who had promised to restore the country's values, have lived a life so at odds with everything he had claimed to protect? The military, once unwavering in its loyalty to Traore, was now divided. The news reached the highest echelons of the government and the armed forces, where the lines between loyalty and betrayal began to blur. Some of his closest allies who had helped him seize power were now quietly distancing themselves from him. In the corridors of the military, the whispers had shifted from rumors to certainty. The leader they had sworn to follow was not who they thought he was. The international community, too, reacted swiftly. The European Union, the United States, and several human rights organizations condemned the hypocrisy, calling for a reevaluation of the laws Traore had imposed. International pressure on Burkina Faso's government was at an all-time high. The world was watching, and Traore's carefully built image was beginning to crumble under the weight of the truth. But it wasn't just the international backlash that Traore had to contend with. It was the growing unrest at home. The people of Burkina Faso, many of whom had supported him for his bold stance against Western influence, were now questioning whether they could trust their leader. The scandal wasn't just about an affair. It was about the man who had promised to be the moral compass of the nation, only to be exposed as someone who had lived a lie. Inside the walls of the presidential palace, Captain Traore sat alone, his mind racing. He knew the tide had turned. His carefully crafted image of strength, of moral integrity, was now shattered. The scandal was too big, too public to ignore. He had to act quickly, but he also knew that no matter what he did, he could never undo the damage that had been done. His world was unraveling. In the following days, Traore's political enemies, those who had once been silent, waiting for the right moment, began to make their moves. The first steps toward his downfall had begun. A motion was tabled in the National Assembly, calling for an official investigation into the affair and his leadership. The military, which had once rallied behind him, was now uncertain. Could they trust a leader who had betrayed their values so publicly? For Ibrahim Traoré, the game had changed. What was once a fight for the soul of Burkina Faso had now become a personal battle for survival. The truth had been exposed, and there was no turning back. His legacy, once seemingly secure, was now in jeopardy. The first leak had set the stage for what was to come. The truth was out, and the consequences were inevitable. The question now was not whether Traoré could recover, but whether he could hold on to his power long enough to weather the storm. The storm had arrived. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, once hailed as a bold, decisive leader, now found himself under siege from all sides. The scandal had broken wide open, and the repercussions were felt across every corner of Burkina Faso. The photograph of his secret relationship, combined with the detailed leaks that had spread through the media, left the nation in a state of shock. His reputation, built on promises of morality and traditional values, was now in tatters. Traoré sat in his office, surrounded by the faces of his closest advisors, but the air was thick with tension. His once unshakable confidence had begun to wane, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. His inner circle had slowly fractured. Those who had been loyal to him through the coup, those who had fought alongside him to overthrow the old regime, now looked at him with a mix of doubt and mistrust. "What are we going to do, sir?" Colonel Jean-Baptiste, one of Traoré's most trusted officers, asked quietly. He had been with the captain since the beginning, through every battle and every political maneuver. But now, the weight of the scandal seemed to have broken something in him. He could no longer ignore the questions that plagued him. Traoré looked at the room full of people who had once shared his vision. His gaze was piercing, his lips pressed tight, and his mind was racing. He had expected opposition, but not this kind of betrayal. It was clear now that his enemies were no longer just political rivals. They were within his own ranks. "We need to act fast," Traoré finally said, his voice low but steady. "The longer we let this drag on, the more we lose control. I need to address the nation, to take charge of this narrative." But there was a deeper problem Traoré had not fully acknowledged until now. The fundamental trust between him and the people had been broken. His attempt to maintain a sense of strength and control by holding public speeches and issuing defiant statements was falling on deaf ears. People had seen the truth, and once the truth was out, it couldn't be ignored or repressed. The morning after the leak had been published, the streets of Ouagadougou had been filled with protesters. Thousands of people, young and old, men and women, had gathered in front of government buildings, waving banners, chanting for accountability, and demanding that the captain step down. It was the first real challenge to his power since he had taken control of the country. His advisors had urged him to remain calm, to wait for the storm to pass. But the protests grew, and soon the entire country was divided. Many of the citizens who had once supported Traoré for his bold stand against Western influence now saw him as a symbol of hypocrisy. They felt betrayed, not just by his private actions, but by the lies he had told in public. Meanwhile, international voices were quick to weigh in. The United Nations condemned the law that had criminalized homosexuality, and human rights organizations continued to push for its repeal. Western countries, which had once been wary of his regime but willing to support him out of strategic necessity, now demanded that Burkina Faso reverse its stance. But it was not just the foreign backlash that made the situation worse. Traoré's own military was starting to turn against him. It wasn't an outright mutiny, at least not yet, but there was growing dissent within the ranks. Officers who had once pledged loyalty to him were now openly questioning his leadership. Whispers of his scandalous relationship were no longer confined to the streets of Ouagadougou. They had infiltrated the military barracks. In the early hours of the next morning, Traoré called for an emergency meeting with his top military generals. The meeting was held in a secret location, away from the prying eyes of the public. When the generals arrived, they were met with a somber atmosphere. "I have done everything I can to protect this country, to strengthen it, to bring it back from the brink," Traoré began, his voice rough. "But now I find myself facing the consequences of my own actions." There was silence in the room as his generals exchanged glances, some unsure of what to say, others clearly waiting for a sign of leadership from their captain. "You know the situation is beyond repair," General Almer, an old ally of Traoré, finally said. "We can't keep this up. The people are turning against us. The world is watching. If you continue to deny the truth, we risk losing everything." Traoré's eyes flickered, a mixture of frustration and regret crossing his face. "I never intended for this to happen," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "But I have worked too hard to let this country fall into chaos. If I step down now, the entire country will collapse." General Almer was blunt. "You are already losing the country, Captain. The law you passed has divided us, and now this affair, your personal life, hidden for so long, has shattered the trust of the people. We need a new direction. The military cannot remain loyal to someone who no longer commands their respect." Traoré sat back in his chair, his hands clenched tightly. He knew what was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The military was his last line of defense, and if they were turning against him, then he had no choice but to face the reality of his situation. "I've failed," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "But I won't let this country fall apart because of my mistakes." In the days that followed, Traoré's fate was sealed. The pressure from his own military and the mounting public outcry forced him to make a decision that would change the course of his life and Burkina Faso's future. On national television, Ibrahim Traoré made his final address to the nation. His voice, once strong and commanding, now trembled with uncertainty. He confessed to his actions, admitting his personal mistakes and the hypocrisy that had led to his downfall. It was the first time the nation saw a vulnerable side of their leader, one that contradicted the image of strength he had so carefully built. "I have let you down," Traoré said in a hoarse voice, his eyes meeting the camera. "The laws I created, the image I projected, all of it was built on a lie. I thought I could hide behind power, behind my duty, but I can't. I have failed you, and for that I am truly sorry. It's time for me to step aside." With those words, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's reign came to an end. The once mighty leader, who had promised to restore Burkina Faso's sovereignty and values, was now a man without power, betrayed not just by the people he had sought to protect, but by his own actions. The aftermath was chaotic. The nation was left to pick up the pieces of its fractured leadership, while the world watched as one of Africa's most controversial leaders fell from grace. The marriage law Traoré had passed was quickly repealed, and the political landscape of Burkina Faso shifted dramatically. In the end, it was clear. Ibrahim Traoré's story was a tragic one, a story of power, hypocrisy, and the inevitable price of secrets that could not remain hidden forever. The dust had settled. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer the leader of Burkina Faso, and the political landscape had been irrevocably altered. The country was left to grapple with the consequences of his actions, his affair, the controversial marriage law, and the seismic shift in trust that had left the nation fractured and uncertain. Yet even in the wake of his downfall, the true impact of his leadership and his demise would be felt for years to come. The morning after Traoré's resignation, Ouagadougou, the capital, was eerily quiet. The protests that had once flooded the streets had calmed, replaced by a heavy sense of anticipation. People wondered what would come next, but more importantly, they wondered how they would rebuild their fractured country. It was as though the air itself had been thick with the tension of the past months, and now, with Traoré's resignation, there was a kind of oppressive stillness. In the wake of the scandal, the military junta that had once rallied behind Traoré was fractured. Many of the senior officers who had been loyal to him were now facing calls for their own accountability. The military's support for Traoré had been one of his greatest strengths, but now that support had eroded. His former allies in the ranks were now just as divided as the rest of the nation. The National Assembly, once under Traoré's firm control, quickly began to reevaluate the laws and reforms that he had put in place. The marriage law, which had sparked so much division, was swiftly repealed, but the damage had already been done. The law had been a catalyst for a deeper discussion about the rights of LGBTQ+ individuals, not only in Burkina Faso but across Africa. Yet, despite the political turmoil, there was a sense of relief for many in the country. For the LGBTQ+ community, it felt as though they had won a significant victory, but the reality was much more complicated. The struggle was far from over. The echoes of Traoré's oppressive laws and the shadow of his reign lingered in the minds of many. As for Ibrahim Traoré, his life had been turned upside down. The man who had once stood so firmly at the helm of the nation was now a pariah, his name tarnished by scandal, his dreams of power shattered. He retreated into obscurity, far from the spotlight he had once basked in. Some believed he would go into exile, but he chose instead to live quietly, away from the public eye. But even in his silence, there were those who still looked up to him. Traoré, despite his failures, had inspired a generation of people who believed in the power of sovereignty and the desire to reshape their nation. Some saw his downfall as the result of his own contradictions, his inability to reconcile his public persona with his private life. But others, more cynically, saw it as a warning. That power, no matter how righteous it may seem, always comes at a cost. In the years that followed, Burkina Faso continued to rebuild. New leaders emerged, but the scars of Traoré's reign remained. The country had learned a hard lesson about the dangers of absolute power, of leaders who preached one thing and lived another. The marriage law would eventually be replaced by new, more inclusive policies, but the damage done to the country's social fabric would take much longer to heal. Traoré's downfall had also changed the perception of leadership across Africa. His story became one of caution, an example of a leader who had risen on promises of tradition and power, only to fall because of the very secrets he tried to hide. Other African nations, watching the events unfold in Burkina Faso, began to reconsider their own leaders' stances on human rights, politics, and personal morality. But perhaps the most profound consequence of Traoré's downfall was the shift in the collective consciousness of the Burkinabe people. The scandal, though deeply painful, had sparked a national conversation about values, governance, and the power of transparency. It showed the country the dangers of blind loyalty and the necessity of holding leaders accountable, no matter how charismatic or powerful they might seem. For some, the memory of Ibrahim Traoré would forever be tied to betrayal, hypocrisy, and the broken trust that he had left in his wake. For others, his reign represented a period of hope and possibility, even if it had ultimately been marred by scandal. The fall of Ibrahim Traoré is a story of power, lies, and redemption lost. In the wake of his downfall, Burkina Faso faces a new future, one where the lessons of the past will shape the leaders of tomorrow. The price of secrecy is steep, and the truth, no matter how deeply hidden, always finds a way to surface. In the aftermath of the fall of Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso faced a crossroads. The country, scarred by scandal and political unrest, had to find a way to heal and rebuild. But the road ahead was uncertain, and the price of rebuilding was high. Could the nation find a new way forward, or would the echoes of the past continue to haunt its future? Months passed since Ibrahim Traoré's resignation, and while the streets of Ouagadougou had quieted, the heart of Burkina Faso was still uneasy. The dust of Traoré's downfall had not fully settled, and the scars he left were still visible in the political landscape. Yet, as with any revolution or upheaval, time moved forward and life began to pick up the pieces. The question on everyone's mind was simple: what next? Burkina Faso had been through so much: years of insurgencies, a military coup, a scandal that shattered the fabric of society. Could the country now rise from the ashes and rebuild, or would it remain trapped in the wreckage of the past? The answer, like the country itself, was complicated. The military, once unified behind Traoré's leadership, was now in disarray. The loyalty that had been so absolute had splintered, and the officer corps was left grappling with the truth about their former leader. For some, the scandal marked the end of an era. For others, it was a call for change. In the National Assembly, new voices began to emerge as well. The men and women who had once been silenced by Traoré's iron grip were now speaking up, calling for reforms that would ensure that such a scandal would never happen again. Among them was a young politician named Amina Kouyaté, who had spent years working in the grassroots movements and had become a powerful voice for transparency and accountability. "We cannot rebuild on the foundation of lies and secrecy," Amina said in one of her early speeches after the scandal. "We must be a nation of justice, where power is not a tool for a few to enrich themselves, but a responsibility to protect the rights of all." Her words resonated with many. After months of political wrangling, the country's first national convention for reform was held. Representatives from all sectors of society, including women's groups, LGBTQ+ advocates, religious leaders, and youth organizations, gathered in Ouagadougou. It was a moment of rare unity in a country that had seen so much division. The road to recovery, though difficult, had begun. For the first time in years, there was hope. Traoré's laws were overturned, and new policies were put in place, focusing on inclusivity, human rights, and reconciliation. The debate on LGBTQ+ rights, once a taboo subject, became part of a broader conversation about civil liberties and personal freedoms. The country was not ready to embrace full equality yet, but the groundwork had been laid for future change. Meanwhile, the international community, though critical of the past, began to cautiously engage with Burkina Faso once more. The European Union, the United States, and African neighbors offered their support for the reforms, providing economic aid and expertise in rebuilding the country's institutions. The West, although wary of the political turmoil that had followed Traoré's rise and fall, recognized the potential for a fresh start. However, the rebuilding process was never going to be easy. The wounds left by Traoré's rule ran deep. The people had been betrayed by the very leader they had trusted to protect their values. His affair, the marriage law, the subsequent scandal, these were not just political issues, they were deeply personal. For many, especially those in the LGBTQ+ community, it would take years to heal. The religious divide in Burkina Faso also posed a challenge. With a population of 64% Muslim and 26% Christian, the country had long struggled to balance its religious values with the demands of a modern, progressive society. The new laws, especially those on marriage and human rights, were met with resistance from some of the more conservative factions. Amina Kouyaté, who had become one of the most powerful figures in the reform movement, was aware of the difficult road ahead. "This is not about tearing down our traditions, but about evolving them," she said during one of her addresses to the nation. "We can be a country of faith, but we must also be a country that believes in the dignity of every person, regardless of who they love or what they believe." Despite the resistance, the reforms continued. Education became a focal point of the new government. It was seen as a way to undo the harm that had been done during Traoré's reign, especially in the areas of human rights education and the promotion of equality. Schools began to teach not just the importance of national unity, but also the values of tolerance and respect for others. Traoré's downfall also created a shift in the way Burkinabe citizens viewed their leaders. For the first time in a long while, there was a growing sense of empowerment among the people. They had seen the damage that absolute power could do, and many were determined to never let it happen again. The idea of holding leaders accountable, of demanding transparency, became a rallying cry. As the years passed, the scars left by Traoré's rule began to fade, though they would never fully disappear. The country had been tested in ways it never expected, but in the end it was stronger for it. The people of Burkina Faso learned the hard way that power, no matter how righteous it may seem, always carries a price. They also learned that the road to true leadership is paved not with promises, but with integrity, transparency, and respect for all citizens. The legacy of Ibrahim Traoré was one of both destruction and renewal. His rise to power, his downfall, and the reforms that followed became a pivotal moment in the history of Burkina Faso. It was a story of betrayal, but also of hope, a hope that, even in the darkest of times, a nation could rise from the ashes and build something better. The fall of Ibrahim Traoré taught the world that no leader is above accountability. But from the ruins of his reign, Burkina Faso began to rebuild, a nation stronger, wiser, and determined to never forget the lessons of the past. The future is uncertain, but the people are no longer afraid to shape it. As the months rolled by, the government of Burkina Faso slowly began to stabilize. The initial chaos following Traoré's resignation had subsided, but the path ahead was far from clear. It was not just the policies and laws that needed to be rebuilt, it was the very spirit of the nation. Trust, once shattered by scandal and betrayal, would take years to mend. The people were left to pick up the pieces of their collective identity and decide what kind of nation they wanted to be. At the heart of the new government's efforts was a commitment to reconciliation. The National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, formed in the aftermath of Traoré's fall, was tasked with addressing the deep divisions that had plagued the country. Its mission was clear: to heal the wounds left by Traoré's regime and restore trust between the people and their leaders. The Commission's first challenge was to deal with the political polarization that had emerged during Traoré's time in power. Supporters of the former leader were reluctant to let go of the vision he had promised. To them, his promises of sovereignty, strength, and resistance against Western influence still held weight. But for the victims of his laws, the LGBTQ+ community, human rights advocates, and others who had suffered under his authoritarian rule, the pain was too fresh to forgive easily. In a historic move, the government began a series of town hall meetings across the country, giving the people a platform to voice their frustrations and hopes for the future. These meetings, led by Amina Kouyaté, now the Minister of Social Affairs, became a symbol of the government's commitment to listening to the people, not just the elites, but the everyday Burkinabe citizen. "It's time we stop pretending that the pain isn't real," Amina told a crowd in Bobo Dioulasso, the country's second-largest city. "We cannot move forward without first acknowledging the wounds of the past. We must listen to each other, even when the truth is hard to hear." Amina's words struck a chord. Across the country, people gathered in open forums to discuss the ways in which Traoré's laws had affected their lives. For many, this was the first time they had been given a voice. Stories of loss, fear, and shame were shared, but so were stories of resilience, hope, and the desire to move forward. Slowly, a new narrative was being woven into the fabric of Burkina Faso's national identity, a narrative of empathy, accountability, and a collective commitment to justice. The LGBTQ+ community, still reeling from the trauma of the laws Traoré had enacted, found a voice in these forums. They spoke of the years of hiding, of living in fear, of being criminalized for something as basic as love. But they also spoke of hope. The repeal of the marriage law was a crucial victory, but many understood that true equality would take time. "Our fight is not just for the right to love," said Isaac Kabore, a prominent LGBTQ+ activist. "It's for the right to live freely, without fear of retribution, without shame. It's for the right to exist without being criminalized. This is not just a victory for us, but for every person who believes in freedom." While progress was being made, the nation was still divided. Some factions within the government, particularly those with ties to religious and traditional institutions, resisted the reforms. They argued that the country's values were rooted in faith and customs that could not be ignored. The debate over the role of religion in politics and the place of LGBTQ+ rights within that framework became one of the most contentious issues. Yet for every step backward, there were more steps forward. Amina Kouyaté, now a beacon of the reform movement, pushed for policies that would protect not only the LGBTQ+ community, but also women's rights, youth empowerment, and the rights of religious minorities. Slowly, the government began to push through new legislation that supported freedom of expression, the right to assemble, and the right to education without discrimination. In 2025, Burkina Faso hosted the first-ever National Reconciliation Day, a public holiday dedicated to acknowledging the scars of the past and celebrating the progress made toward healing. The day began with a moment of silence for those who had suffered under Traoré's regime, followed by a series of cultural performances that celebrated the diversity of the country. Leaders from across Africa attended, offering their support for Burkina Faso's journey of healing. "The real heroes are the ones who never gave up, the ones who kept fighting for what is right, even when it seemed impossible," said Amina in her speech at the end of the day. "We have come a long way, but the journey is far from over. Let us continue to work together, to heal together, and to build a country that we can all be proud of." But even as the government made strides in rebuilding, the ghosts of the past continued to haunt the people. The scars of betrayal were not easily forgotten, and some still struggled to accept the leader they had once followed, now tarnished by his hypocrisy and his fall from grace. Some still clung to the memories of his promises, while others rejected them entirely. For Ibrahim Traoré, the days of power were behind him. He lived in isolation, far from the spotlight that had once been his constant companion. His legacy was a divided one. Some remembered him as a hero who had risen to restore national pride, while others saw him as a man who had used the people's trust for his own gain. Whether he ever sought redemption was a question that would never be answered. As for Burkina Faso, the future remained uncertain, but hope was on the horizon. The lessons of Traoré's reign had been painful, but they were not in vain. The country had learned that no leader, no matter how powerful, could escape the truth. And while the road to full reconciliation was long, the people of Burkina Faso had shown that they were ready to walk it together. The story of Ibrahim Traoré would remain a chapter in the country's history, A dark chapter, yes, but one that would ultimately lead to a new beginning. A beginning rooted in truth, justice, and a shared commitment to building a better future for all. It had been 5 years since Ibrahim Traoré's resignation, and the country of Burkina Faso was still picking up the pieces. The nation had moved from the ashes of scandal, reform, and division to a place where it was now beginning to stabilize. But that didn't mean everything was healed. The legacy of the former leader still haunted the halls of power, still echoed in the hearts of those who had lost faith in their leaders. For Amina Kouyate, now president of Burkina Faso, the journey had been both triumphant and heart-wrenching. Elected in a landslide victory by a public yearning for change, she had become the face of the country's rebirth. Amina had fought tirelessly for the laws of equality and justice, and had led the charge in rebuilding trust between the government and the people. Her leadership had been instrumental in re-establishing Burkina Faso's position on the global stage, but the task was far from over. It was early in the morning when she stood at the edge of a balcony, looking out over the city of Ouagadougou. The sun had just risen, casting a golden hue over the streets and buildings. It was a moment of quiet reflection as she thought of everything the country had been through, the loss, the division, the betrayal, but also the resilience, the strength, and the courage of the Burkinabe people. Despite the horrors of the past, the country had survived, and it was starting to thrive once again. But not everyone was convinced. There were still pockets of resistance, groups that clung to the old ways, the old values, and who saw the new laws as an affront to their traditions. These voices were especially loud when it came to LGBTQ+ rights, women's rights, and the recognition of marginalized communities. Amina knew that the work wasn't finished, and perhaps it would never be. True change was a slow process, one that took generations, not years. She turned to face him, nodding, before following him into the building. Today was an important day. The newly elected government had scheduled a referendum on a set of constitutional amendments that would further secure human rights protections across the country. It was a historic moment, one that would solidify the reforms that had been put in place after Traoré's fall. As she entered the meeting hall, she saw the faces of her fellow ministers, advisors, and lawmakers. Many had been with her from the very beginning of her political career. Others were new faces, representatives of the younger generation who had been the driving force behind the changes. The room buzzed with anticipation. The referendum was not just about the legal amendments, it was about the future of the country. This was a pivotal moment in the history of Burkina Faso. Amina stood at the front, ready to address the room. Her voice was calm but firm as she spoke, her words weighted with the responsibility of leadership. Today, we are not just voting on laws. We are voting on the kind of nation we want to be, a nation of justice, equality, and respect for all its citizens, she began, looking around the room at the faces of those who had supported her and those who still questioned the path she had chosen. Let us remember the lessons of the past, she continued. Let us not be blinded by the weight of tradition or the desire to hold on to old ways. Let us embrace the future, one where every individual, regardless of who they love, where they come from, or how they choose to live, has the right to live with dignity. Her speech was met with a standing ovation from many of the attendees, but she could see the unease in the faces of others, those who still saw her leadership as a break from the values they held dear. Amina knew the work was far from done, but today was a moment of progress, and she had to push forward. When the results of the referendum came in later that day, the outcome was clear. The majority of Burkinabe citizens had voted in favor of the amendments, cementing human rights protections for LGBTQ+ individuals, women, and marginalized communities into the Constitution. It was a monumental victory for those who had fought for a more inclusive Burkina Faso, but Amina knew that it was only the first step. In the weeks that followed, the challenges of governing continued. There were still protests, still cries of opposition from those who believed the reforms went too far. The country's rich cultural history, steeped in traditions and religious practices, couldn't simply be erased. The balancing act between progress and tradition was an ongoing struggle, and Amina had to remain vigilant in the face of constant scrutiny. But for the first time in years, there was a growing sense of optimism in the air. The country was no longer consumed by the bitterness of the past. The people had chosen a path forward, one where their differences could be celebrated, not feared. It was a long road ahead, but Amina Kouyate had become the beacon of hope that Burkina Faso needed. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré remained in the shadows, far from the public eye. The former captain's downfall had been swift and unforgiving, and his name was now a whispered cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and hypocrisy. His legacy was tarnished, and while some still remembered the promises he made, the truth about his actions had erased any chance of redemption. As for the people of Burkina Faso, they had learned a difficult but important lesson. The fight for justice, equality, and transparency was never easy, but it was always worth it. They had seen how a leader could rise to power on promises of change, only to fall due to his own contradictions. They had seen how a nation could be divided by scandal, only to heal through collective action and the courage to face the truth. In the years to come, as Burkina Faso continued to grow and evolve, the story of Ibrahim Traoré and his fall from grace would remain a pivotal chapter in the country's history. But it would no longer define them. Instead, it was the story of resilience, hope, and unity that would carry them forward. The struggle for justice, equality, and reconciliation in Burkina Faso is far from over. As the country moves forward, new challenges arise, threatening to divide the nation once again. Can the progress made under Amina Kouyate's leadership withstand the growing tensions? Will the lessons of the past be enough to guide the nation to a brighter future? Burkina Faso stood at a crossroads. After years of turmoil and transformation, the country was in the midst of a fragile rebuilding process. The reforms put in place by Amina Kouyate, who had become a symbol of change, were beginning to show results. But there was still resistance, and the challenges were far from over. The road to progress was paved with obstacles that, despite the victories, still loomed large on the horizon. Amina, now firmly established as the nation's first female president, stood in the midst of her presidency with a strong, resolute determination. Her administration had overseen the passage of landmark reforms, ensuring equal rights for the LGBTQ+ community, strengthening protections for women, and embracing a more inclusive political climate. Yet, with every step forward, there were voices pulling back, reluctant to let go of the past. One of the most pressing issues now facing Amina was the political divide between the modernists, who pushed for a more progressive Burkina Faso, and the conservatives, who continued to resist changes that threatened to alter the very fabric of their society. The marriage law that had been repealed just years earlier continued to spark debate. But Amina's government was resolute. She had learned from the mistakes of the past, and she knew that progress could not come without cost. She knew that compromise, as difficult as it might be, was the only way forward. As she prepared to address the nation in a televised speech, the weight of her responsibilities bore down on her. She was about to announce a series of new reforms, this time focused on education and interfaith dialogue, designed to bridge the gap between the country's divided communities. But she was aware that every step would be scrutinized, and no matter how well-intentioned, the path forward was fraught with danger. Burkina Faso cannot be built on division, Amina began in her speech, her voice steady, but filled with the knowledge of the hard road ahead. For too long, our country has been torn apart by ideology, by fear, and by intolerance. Today, I stand before you, not as a leader of a single group, but as the leader of all Burkinabe people, to say that we must embrace unity in the face of our differences. Her words were met with applause from some, but the reactions outside the capital were more complex. In rural regions, where traditional values held the greatest sway, Amina's speech was met with resistance. The conservative factions, backed by influential religious figures, immediately rallied against the reforms, declaring them a violation of Burkina Faso's sacred cultural heritage. "I was born here and my father and grandfather before me. We've always been a country of strong faith and tradition. We can't allow foreign ideas to tear that apart," said Sheikh Hassan, a prominent religious leader, in a televised interview. Amina Kouyaté has forgotten the foundations on which this nation was built. In the face of such opposition, Amina was forced to confront the reality that the road to reconciliation was not a smooth one. While many citizens applauded her progressive vision, the rural and more conservative areas of Burkina Faso were slow to embrace change. The divide between the urban elites, who had embraced the reforms, and the rural populations, who saw these changes as a threat to their way of life, became a widening chasm. It was during one of her trips to a rural village in the east of the country that Amina truly felt the weight of the challenge before her. She sat down with a group of elders, many of whom had lived through the tumultuous years of colonization and military rule, and who now found themselves at odds with the direction the country was taking. "We respect you, Madam President," one elder said, his voice heavy with years of experience. "But you must understand that our culture, our faith, is what has kept us strong. The changes you are pushing, these new laws, they don't fit with who we are. We've always been a people who follow God's teachings, and this is too much." Amina listened carefully, her heart heavy. She understood their concerns. The rural regions of Burkina Faso were steeped in traditions that had been passed down for generations. To them, the notion of same-sex marriage or even women's rights in the workplace felt like a direct challenge to the world they had known for so long. But Amina was also keenly aware that the country could not remain stagnant. The world was changing, and so too must Burkina Faso. She did not want to erase tradition, but she did want to create a society where all voices were heard, where all citizens, regardless of their gender, sexual orientation, or religion, could live freely and equally. "I understand your concerns," Amina responded, "and I will not ask you to forget who you are. But we cannot allow the fear of change to stop us from creating a better future. I want a Burkina Faso where every citizen, every woman, every child, every person has the right to live without fear. A Burkina Faso that is strong not because it holds onto the past, but because it embraces the future." The conversation was difficult, but it was necessary. Over the next few years, Amina's government focused on fostering dialogue between the country's diverse groups, holding town halls, facilitating community discussions, and establishing interfaith councils designed to bring together religious leaders from all faiths. The goal was not to change people's beliefs, but to help them understand the importance of respect, tolerance, and unity in a modern society. But progress was slow. Some communities remained resistant, and protests continued in parts of the country. Even as Burkina Faso slowly evolved, the memory of Ibrahim Traoré's divisive rule lingered, casting a long shadow over Amina's reforms. Despite these challenges, Amina knew that she had made the right choice. The road to full reconciliation would take years, perhaps even decades, but the foundation had been laid. The country had taken its first steps toward healing, and while the journey was far from over, there was a glimmer of hope. Burkina Faso had endured the chaos of the past, and now, at last, it was beginning to heal. Amina's leadership, though contested by some, was steadily guiding the country toward a more inclusive and just future. The future was uncertain, but the people of Burkina Faso, for the first time in a long while, had hope that they could overcome their divisions and build a nation where all could thrive. Part 12: The Tipping Point. By 2030, Burkina Faso had undergone years of turbulent change. Amina Kouyaté's presidency had brought hope, but the challenges had also tested the country's resolve. For all the reforms made, lifting the veil on LGBTQ+ rights, ensuring protections for women, and redefining what it meant to be a nation of equality, the road to true unity was anything but smooth. In Ouagadougou, tensions had been rising. The urban areas where the effects of Amina's reforms had been most visible continued to thrive. The younger generation, influenced by global ideas of freedom and equality, embraced the new policies. There was a sense of hope, of possibilities that had once seemed out of reach. But in the rural regions, where tradition and religion held sway, resistance was as fierce as ever. The idea of a country where same-sex marriage was possible, where women could freely choose their careers, and where religion was no longer the defining force of government was a step too far for many. For some, it felt like an affront to their very identity, to their values, and to the history they had always known. The divide was not just political, it was cultural, ideological, and deeply emotional. In the far northeast, a religious leader named Imam Ibrahim Fofana had emerged as one of the most vocal opponents to the reforms. A charismatic figure with deep influence among the rural population, Imam Fofana had long believed that Burkina Faso's path to salvation lay in its adherence to traditional Islamic principles. He spoke passionately about the erosion of family values and the dangers of Western influence, framing the reforms as a deliberate attack on their way of life. Burkina Faso was built on the strength of our faith and our traditions, Imam Fofana declared in one of his speeches, which was broadcasted across the country. These reforms are nothing more than a foreign agenda aimed at destroying the fabric of our society. Our children are taught to reject God's laws in favor of what? So-called rights. This is not our destiny. We must fight to preserve the soul of our nation. His words resonated deeply with many, particularly in the conservative regions. The discontent that had been simmering for years erupted into protests and demonstrations in the rural towns, led by religious groups and conservative political leaders who shared Imam Fofana's views. The streets of smaller cities were filled with people marching in opposition to what they saw as the disintegration of their values. But the urban centers were not without their own struggles. The growing divide between the modernists and traditionalists had led to violent clashes in some areas, with protests turning into riots. The military, still deeply divided after Traoré's downfall, struggled to maintain control. Some officers aligned themselves with the conservative factions, believing that their loyalty to the country's traditions was paramount. It was at this moment of crisis that Amina Kouyaté was forced to make a decision that would define the future of Burkina Faso. The country was on the brink. One misstep could lead to a civil war, while the other could solidify her place as a historic leader. She knew the path of reconciliation would not be easy, and now, the very fabric of her leadership was being tested. Her advisors gathered in the presidential palace to discuss the next steps. The situation had reached a tipping point. Violence had erupted in several provinces, and the protests were growing in intensity. The world was watching, and the international community was pressuring Amina to take decisive action. Some urged her to call for martial law, to crush the protests and restore order by force. "I cannot be the president of only half the country," Amina said during the meeting, her voice calm but filled with the weight of the decision before her. "I must be the president of all Burkina Faso, even those who disagree with me." Her decision was clear. She would travel to the northeast, to the heart of the resistance, to meet with Imam Fofana and his supporters. It was a risky move. Many feared that it would only fuel the flames of division. But Amina knew that the only way forward was through direct engagement. It was time to face the very heart of the opposition, to show that she was willing to listen to their concerns, to find a way to bridge the deep divide that had formed. In an unprecedented move, Amina took a convoy and traveled to the small town of Kaya, where Imam Fofana had set up his base of operations. As she stepped out of her vehicle, the air was thick with tension. Thousands of people had gathered, their faces filled with distrust and suspicion. This was not a simple political rally, it was a confrontation. Imam Fofana, flanked by his followers, stood at the front of the crowd. His face was stern, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. As Amina approached, she could feel the weight of the moment. This was not just about political maneuvering. It was a test of her leadership, her ability to unite a nation on the brink of chaos. "I am here today," Amina began, her voice strong but conciliatory, "because I believe in the future of Burkina Faso, a future where every citizen, no matter their faith, no matter their identity, has a voice. I know we have differences, but I also know that we have a common goal, a country that is safe, prosperous, and free for everyone." Imam Fofana's response was not immediate. He stood in silence for a moment, weighing her words carefully. Then slowly he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of years of tradition. "Madam President," he began, "we do not seek conflict, but we cannot accept a future that denies our values. If you truly seek unity, you must understand the importance of preserving what we hold sacred." The two leaders stood face to face, the tension palpable. But this was not a confrontation, it was a dialogue. Amina listened, and Imam Fofana heard her words. The beginning of a conversation that had seemed impossible just months before was now unfolding. The days following Amina Kouyate's unprecedented meeting with Imam Fofana and the conservative factions in Kaya were filled with tension, but also a flicker of hope. The dialogue, though fraught with challenges, had opened a path that many had thought impossible. The divisions that had torn at the fabric of Burkina Faso's society for years had not been healed overnight, but for the first time in years, there was an opportunity to move forward together. Amina knew the road ahead would not be easy. Imam Fofana and his supporters were not going to suddenly accept every reform she had introduced. They were not going to abandon their traditions overnight. But the mere fact that they had agreed to continue the conversation was a step in the right direction. It was a sign that, at the very least, they were willing to listen, to understand one another. The government quickly organized a national summit in Ouagadougou, bringing together religious leaders, community representatives, activists, politicians, and ordinary citizens. The summit's goal was clear: to lay the groundwork for long-term peace, unity, and understanding between Burkina Faso's diverse communities. Amina addressed the assembly with a speech that resonated deeply with all who listened. "We have spent too many years divided, too many years afraid of the unknown," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "Today, we take the first steps toward true unity. It's not about erasing our differences, it's about finding strength in them. We are a nation built on faith, on tradition, and on the spirit of resilience. But we must also embrace the future, a future that includes everyone." Her words were met with mixed reactions. Some were still hesitant, others applauded her courage. But Amina knew that this was just the beginning. The journey to healing was not a single speech or a single event. It was a sustained effort, a collective push toward understanding, respect, and equality. Over the following months, the summit led to tangible results. New committees were formed to bridge the gap between religious groups, progressives, and conservatives. These committees focused on education, policy reform, and community-building projects that sought to foster dialogue and understanding. They didn't agree on everything, but they agreed on the importance of a united Burkina Faso. The impact of this effort was not immediate, but it was undeniable. In the streets of Ouagadougou, in the villages of the northeast, and in the rural towns of the west, people began to feel the effects of the change. There was still resistance, and some continued to reject the reforms that Amina had put in place, but there was also a sense of optimism that had not existed before. The country was on the verge of something transformative, and this time the people felt that they were part of it. As Amina looked out from her office in the presidential palace, she realized that this moment, this turning point, was the beginning of a new chapter for Burkina Faso. It had taken years of struggle, of facing uncomfortable truths, of overcoming personal and political barriers, but the country had emerged stronger for it. There were still battles to fight, but now, the people of Burkina Faso had learned that true strength did not lie in division, but in unity. They had learned that despite their differences, they were stronger when they stood together. The hard lessons of the past had not been in vain. they had paved the way for a brighter, more inclusive future. The story of Ibrahim Traoré's rise and fall, the pain of betrayal, and the journey to unity in Burkina Faso is a powerful reminder of the cost of leadership, the value of reconciliation, and the resilience of a people who refuse to let their differences divide them forever. The nation has come a long way, and though the road ahead may still be filled with challenges, there is now hope for a Burkina Faso that embraces justice, equality, and freedom for all. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to stay updated on more gripping tales of transformation, resilience, and leadership, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue to bring you powerful stories that inspire and inform. Together, we can learn from the past and build a brighter future. This part concludes the story of Burkina Faso's path to healing, unity, and progress. Amina Kouyate's leadership is celebrated as a turning point, with the country now on the road to reconciliation. The final message of hope emphasizes the importance of coming together despite differences. The closing paragraph includes a call to action for viewers to engage with the channel.